Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Stevens, and this is the second part of a two-part lecture on reading poetry for my course, Contemporary Religious Poetry. So we started with a poem by R.S. Thomas called The Absence, and we looked a little bit at some of the important characteristics of a poem, uh, those characteristics that make it a poem. And we're going to continue now by looking at another um, poem. This is also from our textbook. The Turning Aside is on page 103 if you want to look it up there. And we're going to continue looking at its characteristics as a poem and then also as a religious poem. So we'll begin by reading Late Prayer by Barbara Crooker. It's not that I'm not trying to love the world and everything in it, but look, that includes people who shoot up schools, not just the blue bird in his coat of sky, his red and white vest, or the starry asters speckling the field. It has to include talk show hosts and all their blather, men with closed minds and hard hearts, not only this sky, full of clouds as a field of sheep, or this wind pregnant with rain. Don't I have enough in my life? What is this wild longing? Is there more to this world than the shining surfaces? Will I be strong enough to row across the ocean of loss when my turn comes to take the oars? All right, a poem by Barbara Crooker. Now, I'm not going to go back over some of the things that I said in the first part of the lecture. For example, we talked about the importance of hearing a poem, reading a poem out loud, and so on. So we'll skip over that part. I would like to begin, first of all, simply by pointing out a characteristic of some religious poetry, which is that it very often has nothing explicitly religious in it. Now, if you look at this poem, there is no reference to religion per se, that is explicitly, other than this word in the title, right? Prayer. That's it. Okay. So the question is, all right, well, how is this a late prayer? What might Barbara Crooker or the speaker in the poem be praying for? And who is she praying to, if that's the case? So we talked in part one about how what makes a poem definitively a poem is compression, the use of language that is compact, meaning that whatever the meaning of the poem is compressed into a few words. Those words might be make up figurative language, right? Such as a metaphor or a simile. And it might be, the compression might be in the form of allusions and references to things that are not explicitly stated. All right. So let's continue looking at these characteristics of poetry in this particular poem. And I'd like to focus also on something we didn't talk about in regard to the absence in the first part of the lecture, and that is the use of imagery. So Crooker starts out with a fairly general statement. It's not that I'm not trying to love the world and everything in it. Okay, well, why would she be trying to love the world? Now, if you're looking for a religious theme, if you're reading a book, such as our book that is supposedly a book about contemporary religious poetry, you might say, okay, well, look, this idea of loving the world and loving things, well, that sounds like a religious concept, so that might work here, right, in some sense. Okay? And then look what she goes on to. So the world and everything in it includes people who shoot up schools, right? Well, this is one of the horrors that we deal with in our time, isn't it? One of the poems that I include in a handout for this particular course is a poem called Rock Me Mercy by the poet Yusuf Komunyakaa, and you can read that. It's in Blackboard. Komunyaka's poem Rock Me Mercy is a poem he wrote in response to the Sandy Hook massacre, the elementary school in Sandy Hook, Connecticut. He wrote it on the day that the shooting actually took place. Well, that's just one of many shootings that we know of that take place in schools. And then, of course, mass shootings in general, not just in schools, but in nightclubs and so on. Now, this is a phenomenon that we're familiar with. All right, that is a reference, but it's not a particularly obscure reference at all, is it? But what's it doing here in this poem? Crooker is saying that if I'm going to love the world, I'm going to have to try to love people who shoot up schools. And then farther on, all right, she says, it's going to have to include talk show hosts. Well, she doesn't like talk show hosts because what they talk is, to her, mostly blather, empty and sometimes hostile language and so on. Oh, it's also going to have to include men with closed minds and hard hearts. And we think of men with people who are prejudiced against people who aren't like them, for example. So, right in our own time, we're struggling with prejudice against immigrants, especially prejudice against illegal immigrants. All right, at the time that I'm recording this lecture anyway, in February of 2018, we understand this. We understand what she's referring to. So we take these references. Reference number one, the idea of loving the world and everything in the world. Okay, idea number one, and then the challenge to love people who shoot up children in schools and so on. How do we do this? All right. So again, the importance of, right, allusion and reference. What happens if I try to make this red? Yeah, I can make that red, right? The importance of allusion and reference, in this case, identifying theme. All right. So we could say, all right, here it seems as though, although there's nothing explicitly religious in this poem, except the idea that it's supposed to be a prayer, right? Theme is loving the world. Okay? And not just the world, but loving those, I mean, not just the nice things in the world, right? But loving the unlovely, even hateful things in the world. Now, here's where some knowledge of religion can be helpful, all right? And that's the idea, rather famous in Christian doctrine, of loving your enemies as well as your neighbors, right? So we could say, oh, I think I know what Crooker is getting at here. All right. This poem seems to be concerned with that difficulty in religion of extending love to everyone. Okay? Now, look at what Crooker is doing. And I want you to look also at the use of imagery here. She says, this is fairly explicit compared to some poems that we are looking at and will be looking at, right? She's saying it includes people who shoot up schools, all right, things that are difficult to love, right? And not just the blue bird in his coat of sky, his red and white vest. Okay, she has an image here of a bird. And notice that she is using metaphorical language here. Okay, a bird, a blue bird, now a bird can be literally blue, right? Okay, that's fine. So we've got a blue bird here, right? So that's literal. But a bluebird does not literally wear the sky, right? So this is metaphorical language. Remember from the first lecture, what a metaphor does is it takes something that is completely different from the thing that it's a metaphor for, all right, and expresses that thing in terms of something else. Now, in the absence, we were talking about expressing abstractions in terms of concrete language. Here, we're talking about something that is itself concrete, that is a bird, but we're talking about it in terms of a coat of sky. Well, the sky is blue, sometimes anyway, right? So Crooker is now treating the bluebird as wearing the sky, and so on. Other images, flowers, the starry asters. Okay? And so on, speckling the field. So, what she's doing is she's contrasting things that are difficult to love, like people who shoot up schools, with things that she does love and finds easy to love. And notice that all of these things are from the natural world. Now, she could, of course, bring in things from the human world that she happens to love, right? I mean, maybe she loves the college that she graduated from, right? She loves her family, she loves her pets. But here she's taking things from the natural world. And it would include this sky full of clouds as a field of sheep, right? White clouds are very often compared with sheep. This is a simile, all right, an explicit comparison. The clouds in the sky are like sheep in a field, right? Another metaphor, wind pregnant with rain. Okay, now, pregnancy means the state of carrying children and bearing children, right? Okay, that's what it means to be pregnant. The wind can't get pregnant in that sense. Wind does not give birth to more wind. Okay, but this is a metaphor for the wind. Main point I'm trying to make here is that Crooker is comparing things that are difficult to love with the things that she does love. And that helps us, again, identify this theme, right? The theme of loving the world, okay, and how difficult it is. It's difficult. Okay? It's difficult to love everything in the world. Very easy to love some things, difficult to love it all. So, what could she then be praying for? This is a late prayer. Now, here is where the theme starts to get more explicitly religious. Crooker seems to be saying, I need help. Well, one of the things that religious people do when they need help is to pray. And although she does not mention God at all in this poem, we can certainly, by the time we've gotten to this point in reading it, we can say she's praying to God for help in trying to love the entire world. Okay? Now, we have, again, getting back to this whole idea of compression, right? We have uh, the idea of loving the world and loving your enemies as well as your neighbors. We have that idea compressed into this poem. It's relatively explicit compared to some poems. There's not as much compression, right? But we're not done. We're not done yet. Because we get to this thing at the end. Will I be strong enough to row across the ocean of loss when my turn comes to take the oars? Now we need to be saying, what the heck does that have to do with loving the world and all that's in it? This is a very, very tricky turn in this poem. I'm going to try to make some sense of it. And it goes back to this phrase, wild longing. She's wondering what this wild longing is. Does she have a wild longing for all of these natural beauties like birds and clouds and wind with the sense of rain in it? Okay, are these the things that she's longing for? But wait a minute, she was talking about the struggle to love all of the unattractive things in the world. Is that part of the wild longing as well? And then she says, is there more to this world than the shining surfaces? I'm going to suggest, she doesn't tell us, all right, but I'm going to suggest that that phrase, shining surfaces, compresses into one phrase all of these things like the bird, the field full of flowers, right? The clouds in the sky, and so on. I'm going to suggest that this is the shining surface of the world, but then she says, is there more to it? What could that more be? She doesn't say. She doesn't say. All she does is she suggests that at some point she's going to need to row across the ocean of loss. So the world, we do know, contains lovely things and things that are not particularly lovely. This could be what is more to this world. We don't know, but we know that somehow she's struggling to love all the world. And that leads her to this question. I've got things that are lovely, I have things that are not very lovely. Is there more to this? Is there something yet to come that I am not aware of? And I think, now this is where interpretation comes in. All right? I see a metaphor here, the ocean of loss, okay? And so I take this metaphor and I begin by saying, okay, what could the ocean of loss be? Well, we do lose things in this life. We have to experience loss, right? We experience the loss of loved ones when they die, for example. Those parents in Sandy Hook had to experience the terrible loss of those children who were shot in that school. So we understand in general what loss is. So we can say, well, we don't know what specific loss she might be referring to. She might even be referring to the loss of her own life, which she's going to have to experience at some point, right? So, rowing across the ocean of loss is a metaphor for experiencing loss in your life. And she's saying basically, okay, I've got this metaphor, and this metaphor is the ocean. I'm going to be rowing across the ocean. Rowing involves oars, right? I use the oars to row across this ocean. I'm rowing. My rowing across the ocean is a metaphor for experiencing loss. Am I going to be strong enough? My turn is going to have to come to take the oars and row across the ocean of loss. Folks, I don't know what the speaker or Barbara Crooker is referring to specifically here, but I can tell you this. She is struggling. She is struggling with this difficulty of loving the world and everything in it. And that has brought her to this point of, let's call it anxiety, let's call it urgency. We don't know exactly what it is. Okay, but I have a wild longing for something. I have a wild longing for something more to this world than these shining surfaces that I love. I'm going to suggest something. Again, this is interpretation. But what I'm going to suggest is that there is a state of, let's call it not just a state of mind, a state of spiritual understanding, religious understanding, a state in which all of a sudden we see how all of these things are reconciled. The good and the bad, the lovely and the ugly, and so on. And I'm saying, is there more? Is there more to this world? And it could be that that question comes out of wondering what it is that can reconcile all of these things. Okay? And she has a wild longing for something. And the wild longing is not just for all of the beautiful things in the world that she has mentioned. The wild longing is for the something more. Okay, so where, when, how will she come to realize the something more? And what I'm going to suggest is that it's going to come through the experience of loss. Will I be strong enough to experience this loss? And will this loss show me what more there is to this world than what I know now? What I know now is that there are ugly things in this world, like people who shoot up schools. I know there are beautiful things in this world, like a sky, clouds like sheep in the sky, and so on. But there is more, and how am I going to know what it is? And maybe I won't know unless I'm strong enough to row through all of the loss that is inevitable in life. So, what we've done here is we've looked a little bit at figurative language. We've identified a theme of loving the world, okay? Loving your enemies as well as your neighbors, and so on. We've looked a little bit at imagery, the imagery, for example, of the flowers in the field, what they suggest, and so on. And we're saying, okay, what And then finally, we're saying the meaning of this poem is really compressed. It seems to be compressed in that conclusion, that wonderful conclusion about rowing across the ocean of loss. It's something that we all have to do, folks. If you deny it, it's going to come back, and it's going to, if it's an ocean of loss, and you deny that ocean, it's going to come back, and a tidal wave's going to drown you. Okay, that's what loss is in this poem. Ocean of loss is something that we all have to experience. Something is being compressed in that whole metaphor of rowing across the ocean of loss. We don't know exactly what it is, and that's part of the challenge of reading a poem, is the compression. So much is compact into so little. And so how do you figure it out? I'm just going to leave you with this one suggestion, which is you figure it out by drawing upon your own experience. You figure it out by drawing on what you might know about religious teaching. That will certainly help in this case. You figure it out by thinking hard about how the different parts of the poem relate. But for me, the most important thing is drawing upon your own experience. What do you have in your life that instructs you about the horrors of school shootings? What do you have in your life that teaches you something about the beauty of nature? What is it that you have in your life that makes you long for an understanding of how this world can have so much beauty in it and at the same time have so much ugliness in it? Do you understand what it is to long for an understanding of that? Okay, can you put all those things together from your own experience? And if you can, then I think you would understand some of the meaning of this poem. Thanks for listening, folks. That's part 2 of the lecture on what makes a poem and how to read a religious poem.